Imagine you are working in a company and things were running very smooth. But then, with this pandemic and economic recession, the company's performance went too low. And to your surprise, you lost your job. Sad and worried you were. You were so anxious and you applied for job in several other companies, bringing you much relief. You got into a new company. A more comfortable job it was, and also the salary was 2 times your previous salary. How happy we would then be. To any incident such as that, a Bible verse that would quickly pop in our mind would be Romans 8 verses 28. We know that all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to His purpose. This is one of the most popular verses in the Bible, but sadly, its usage is not always appropriate. We often use this verse to encourage ourselves or our fellow beings when faced with life's huge setbacks. We claim this verse over our failures and believe that those failures are going to be overturned for our good here and now. Whatever loss we suffer here is going to be repaid with interest. That is what some believes, claiming this verse. But being very honest to ourselves, we know that it is not all good. There are situations in life which were not overturned for our good. There are deaths all across, diseases spreading, so much of suffering in this world, and so for many this verse remains as an unkept promise or a false verse. In this video, we will together explore the true meaning of this verse. The best way to understand its meaning would be to ask certain question that is rising from the verse and find its meaning from the context instead of assuming its meaning to suit our circumstances. The very first question would be, is this verse a promise applicable to all? In this verse, there are two phrases that qualify the people for whom this verse is valid. This verse is applicable only for those who love God and who are called according to His purpose. The first phrase, those who love God alone, can be misleading and can mean that it is solely based on love of human beings for God. But both phrases taken together gives us clarity that believers' love for God is ultimately due to God's purpose in calling them to salvation. This means to say that this verse is applicable only for believers who are called by God and who love God, and it is not for a general unbelieving public. The second question would be, what are the all things in the verse that works together for good? All things can include everything of the present life, but Paul in the context has got a special emphasis. When we look at this chapter, the first 17 verses of this chapter is mainly talking about believers being granted life and adopted as God's children. The very first verse reads that there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ. If there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ, why are they then faced with tough trials? How can those who are set free from the law of sin and death die? Why is there suffering for those whom God has adopted to be His own children? These questions that arise from the first part of this chapter is being answered by Paul from verse 18. From verse 18 onwards, Paul is putting the suffering of the present time in the right perspective. Verse 18 reads, I consider that suffering of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory about to be revealed to us. From the context, we can understand that in verse 28, when Paul says all things are working together for good, the term all things focuses specially on suffering and tribulation of the present life. The third question we need to find answer for is, what is the good mentioned in the verse? This is the most important part to understand the true meaning of the verse. Most of the time when we claim this verse over the bad situations of our life, the good that we have in our mind is not the good this verse really talks about. The good that this verse talks about is mentioned in the very next verse. The good mentioned in verse 28 is conforming to the image of God's Son. This is the highest good that can be achieved. So, what this verse says is God works in such a way that everything that enters the life of a believer is working for their good. That good is all of life's circumstances will accomplish the goal of making the believer more like Jesus Christ. The fourth question would be, when is it going to be all good? The good mentioned in this verse of being conformed to the image of Christ is an ongoing process happening through all of life's equation. Verse 23 gives us an hint of when it is going to be all good. Verse 23 reads like this: we ourselves who have the first fruit of the Spirit groan inwardly while we wait for adoption, the redemption of our bodies. Our conformity to the image of Christ will only be completed when our bodies are redeemed. On earth, this is a lifelong process of transformation to be more like Jesus through each of our life's circumstances. Even Apostle John says, when he is revealed, we will be like him. So this verse finds its total fulfillment when we will be like him at his coming. So then, in conclusion, this verse is not a universal promise for all. It is for those who are called by God. This verse doesn't guarantee that each of life's loss will be repaid here, but it assures that God accomplishes his purpose of conforming to the image of his Son through our life's hard times. That is the good mentioned in this verse. This good will find its ultimate fulfillment only when our bodies are redeemed and we become like him. This understanding grants us hope in the midst of suffering and tribulation of the present time. It helps us to have a right perspective on trials of our life. Is this understanding not the reason why Apostle Paul in the same chapter says, who can separate us from the love of Christ? Will hardship or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword? He was very sure that suffering do not separate us from the love of Christ. Rather, it makes us more like him. Is this understanding not the reason why Paul says in chapter 5, we boast in our suffering? He knew that there is an eternal good that is working in through the suffering of the present age. That is the true meaning of this verse. This implies that the sufferings of the present time is a blessing in disguise, for it molds us more to be like Christ. God bless you.